This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is the Prairie Monks program. Every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. you can hear Dave Monk's show talking about rails, trails, greenways, the ecology, and anything else that has been going on in this area. This is Sunday, May the 6th, 2018.
It's spring and things are starting to grow. The starry-eyed grass is out in flower. Golden Alexander is blooming. Serviceberries have been out. We're in the last 2 weeks, the prairie has grown by 2 feet. It's interesting, the dynamics of it. A couple in passings this week. One was Maria DeWitt, who was passed just this week, and I don't know the details, so we'll do things with her again later. But she had a lot of interest in natural history, along with her husband, Adrian, and just memories of people who have come and helped over the years to preserve natural history in this community. The other one was much more documented. Ray Bowman passed unexpectedly. He was a very active young teacher of science, a thinker, a humorist, a lot of things to a lot of different people. And he passed, and there was a memorial service at Riggs Bar on South 130. It's a very attended memorial. Ray grew up in Wakanda area of Chicago, where grandparents, parents, and her elder brother ran a garage, which was, I imagine, a traditional garage in a local setting. Ray unfortunately got polio, and so he had one gammy leg and had to work with that for all his life. It made him slower, but it didn't stop him from doing things, including one reportee said that Ray was caught taking oil out of his car, and he was underneath, and he unfortunately didn't drain the transmission oil rather than the motor oil. But there was Ray doing it, and he was well known for doing interesting things. He was of a slightly younger generation, and got his bachelor's degree in Chicago, then was at the U of I doing a master's degree. I first encountered him at University High School, where he was teaching, and very innovatively. He went into the Peace Corps in Colombia, learned to speak Spanish, came back, taught some, and got a doctorate. And so some of his mentors were there that signed his thesis. I was looking through his thesis. And George Kiefer and others were supervisors of that thesis. And Ray then taught in other places. He taught in Puerto Rico because he did have Spanish in his background, and at Beaumont, and he taught in Los Angeles for a while, and then was teaching at Wesleyan in Bloomington, then eventually was a professor at Millikan University in Decatur, and he traveled with people, and I got the impression that the travel was an experience in itself, with people back and forth with philosophy and everything else. When he retired, he was teaching at Lille School, transitional students that needed to deal with the fact that their English was their second language. And he got to be a volunteer with the teacher there and understand their experiences and find out who they were. And they loved him in his rather informal but very important situation. He was an inveterate birder and had been to many countries with his wife Liesel, and she was a Wildhagen, and her father was a journalist with the University of Illinois, and so I'd known the Wildhagen family for a long time too. He called within a week of his passing. He called Beth Chato and asked her to come and verify a bird that he'd seen that was rather an unusual bird for this area. And Beth attended, and they verified that this was a bird. And that was part of the memorial service was for people to go to Busey Woods and walk the woods and check the birds that are coming through in spring migration. And they collected 37 species between the crowd. So they have a son, Liesel and Ray have a son, Tad, and he is a librarian, and brother, the elder brother, Steve, gave a family experience, and just all around that was an interesting farewell to a rather spirited gentleman who was part of this community. We will miss him and his general style. So a few other things have been happening. The Forest Preserve District had a 50th anniversary of the Museum of the Grand Prairie, it's now named. And they have a wonderful set of buildings and display of historic materials, some loaned, some permanent, and I was interested to go to that. I actually took a piece of, what would you say, antique preservation. It was a little wind vane with two people that were turning a grindstone, and the grindstone had a little machete that was being sharpened, and there was a water trough underneath, because when you sharpen steel, it gets hot, and you often need to quench it, but you also quench it to give it hardness. So you sometimes have some oil in there that helps to put carbon into the steel and provide some hardness. It had a wind vane, but there's two little propellers that would move with the wind and turn these people to do the grinding of the stone. So, and it was interesting that they were made out of plywood, which was obviously from a very different era. It was not the plywood that you know today. It was much thinner, and probably 2 pieces rather than 3. It was a little dirty because I'd stored it, and it had accumulated dust. I didn't take that off because if you're an archaeologist or a preservation person, you go to that sort of situation with camel hair brushes and do it in a sensible fashion so that you don't destroy anything of the delicate image. And I think they were glad to get that. I talked to Pat Kane. He was a high school teacher, probably a historian, but he's been hired to be a public program and visitor service coordinator. And he's put together quite a bit of this history, including some black history, some history of the Vietnam War, some of the things that you and I have had experience with over the years. I think we'll be lucky enough to have Pat on a program sometime, so I won't take over talking about the museum at the moment, because we probably will do that in a better fashion later. I did walk down the corridors and the agricultural equipment and the things, some of the things I grew up with, because I'm long enough in the tooth to have done that, were there and presented in a nice fashion. Okay, the potpourri. Ron Sleater is a very genuine and very constant aid to our potpourri. He comes at an appropriate time of the year, and we spot herbicide, a very invasive teasel plant. And we've been successful in getting, or he has been successful in eliminating that plant, mostly from in and around the prairie. He comes here at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. We put on board some water to mix with herbicide, which is designed to not damage the prairie around, but to damage this plant with a huge rosette that takes out your prairie. And we took off, and we actually stopped along the way because there's teasel in key places where they know there's good prairie, and it may be that we don't always know the right-of-way, who owns what, whether it's the railroad or the road or private property, but it's mostly public property, but it has this teasel as an invasive plant that destroys the little native prairie, that remnant prairie along the way, so we stopped along the way. The Department of Transportation, in its wisdom, has cleaned out a lot of the garbage that goes with the potpourri. Let me explain that the potpourri has a road that runs through it and or adjacent to it. It's an old road that we talk about from time to time. It's a narrow road. It's concrete because in the workers' era, Depression era, the workers were encouraged to put concrete on that road. It used to be a corduroy road with trees down to stop you from getting bogged. So it was made into a quite functional 2-lane highway that has been replaced. So we have 9 acres of prairie adjacent to a little road and an interurban adjacent to it, and that is a prime place for people to dump, and it's especially lower level contractors who who do things like improve your kitchen or do roofing or and they are reluctant to go to the dumpsters and to costly placement in the landfill. And so they look around and see this rather private road that runs behind a cemetery and is a little hidden, and they dump their goods there. Other people dump things like old-time television sets, and it gets to be rather pain. So we have to do this with volunteers to eliminate it. Then we have to pay for dumping that material in the landfill. It got to be to the extent that the Department of Transportation took a look at it and said, we're not going to have any more of this. We'll put roadblocks on each end of the road, and north and south, and they have to be substantial because we've tried blocking that road off many times, and it lasts about 2 days. And people who want to be there, some of them very legitimately just want to enjoy the natural history that's on either side. Some want to walk dogs, some want just to walk. Some of them are motorcyclists who love to speed through that area, and knowing that there's no supervision on it, or very little. Some want to go onto the prairie at this time of the year when it's a little wet. They just love to bury themselves in the mud, and they can do a lot of damage in 5 minutes to about 70 years of preservation. So I was taking signs with me. I had a contribution that allowed us to get a professional sign replaced. The signs we put up are rough and tough, and they last about 3 years, but then they have to be replaced. So I took with me the original signs, which I covered with a felt tip pen, just to give me some extra signs. But the more professional ones are the ones we need so that people know that this looks like a bunch of weeds, but it's not a place for doing wheelies. So that was my aim, and Ron was doing the herbiciding. The road closures are substantial. Each end there are 2 8-foot concrete slabs that are huge. You would need a hi-ho to remove them, and then locked into that and bolted down as a big sign to say road closed. And that extends so that it would be very hard to get a truck or a pickup truck around it. So what do you do with this sort of thing? It's sad that I can no longer say to a visitor, go to the Pope Prairie and just watch it from the road. If you don't want to walk out and do it, if you want to walk out and do it, just take a pair of boots that can go through a little stream that's there and get onto the other side and just enjoy it and go many times. So we do have people who go there regularly just to honor the prairie. So how do we do with those people? Well, that road continues across a northern section road. I think it's 330, and you can park on the north of that, and the Department of Transportation has been willing to agree to that. We knowingly realized that in order to get into the prairie, we're going to have to cart our water. So we took wheels and a rope to pull the wheels, and we can live with the signs. I think the positive nature of the sign is probably greater than the negative. So people can still stop on the north side or the south side and walk in, and that's quite okay. It's too bad that we have to control these places, but often they're unsupervised, and we can't spend the time of supervising them. And if you gather them up, you have to know that there's going to have to be someone to supervise them in perpetuity. And can you have that? Sometimes it's you have to buy, borrow, beg, or steal a little piece of prairie while it's there. So you buy it when you do not necessarily have the ability to control it. So there's always that problem. The ring counties in Chicago have had to face that problem. Do they buy while they can, like dead railroad lines and things like that, or do they supervise their existing small plots of things like prairie? And universally, they've decided to buy while they can because they'll never buy again. Ron has had in recent times a hip replacement, so this was his first time back herbiciding and testing his hip. That was very generous to do that. I think it was an achievement for him to be able to walk some and do some, and feel very pleased with the operation that he had done. But we didn't stay there as long as we usually do. It usually takes us best part of a day to be doing these things. You need that sort of work. We need volunteers who aren't necessarily going to innovate a concept, but are really into seeing that what is innovated is continued. And so people are there. And I put up signs, and I'm very pleased that they're there. That's if people can read them. You have to be very simple. No long stories about what you have and what this prairie is about. We have both. If you really want to know what we're doing there, we have signs to go up. And I actually need people at the moment to help put those sorts of signs up. They need to be on firm stands. That also means we need to raise the money to have the appropriate backdrops for these things. If you have a sign with writing on it, you probably have to put it on plywood, all-weather plywood, and you have to have a means of tying it to some stakes or whatever, and that's not always easy to do. You cannot put a sign on a stake and then drive the stake in, because the sign will just break off. You have to put in the stake, and it has to be at a measured position, and then you tie your sign on, and you probably rumble the end of the bolt so that it can't be undone. Those signs remain around. We also get Xerox copies and put them in plastic shells, and those will last best part of 2 years. So we try to do things in a cheap manner, but it is in the long run important for us to have a species list and some idea of where you can go. In the Pope Prairie situation, we do have one trail across the creek, which is rather nice. It gives us some wetland. But we don't really encourage people to follow one trail. It's where you walk like a buffalo, where you would want to walk. And that's kind of a national policy with quite a few natural areas, is to not have people wander through them in a alligator line format. You let them walk where they may, and they will destroy a few plants, but usually these are deep-rooted perennial plants, and they'll come back, and you get to see, and you don't get to stop on one trail. We can't teach deer to do that. Deer will take one trail and follow it, as often ruminants do. I grew up with cattle, and cattle make their tracks, and they follow their tracks. They're not wide tracks. They're like 10-inch wide because that's where their feet go. And people have a distance that they can handle. They can handle 2 and 3 foot, 4 foot trails. And sometimes a trail is very useful. But in the case of the Pope Prairie, we try to encourage people to just walk and enjoy and find a little creek. And you can see the areas where wheelies have been done probably 20 years ago, and that damage is still there, and the circle can still be read. So up go the signs, and we're pleased. We've been working with the Pope Prairie in another sense. The titles were not exactly clear. We had not received we bought probably about 8 years ago, and the titles were not exactly clear. So we've gotten with the attorneys involved, the owners that sold to us, and the county board assessment office, and sorted this out so that now we have clear title to that area. So it gives us a little bit of confidence to go ahead and move this into the future. So what would you do for the future? We have the choice of keeping in Heartland Pathways. Heartland Pathways is its attitude over the years has been to initiate an idea and often move it on to other territories that are able to handle this better, or even do innovative things. So the Grand Prairie Friends we initiated after a prairie conference that we held, and that has taken off on its own and done wonderful things with prairie and prairie forests. And so could this particular prairie go to a Grand Prairie Friends? Could it go to a land trust like the land trust that Bruce Hannon runs? Or does it go to the state? How do we look at this and tie it to a more general corridor? This old road we talk about goes all the way to Paxton, 10 miles. And so it goes across jurisdictions. It goes across Champaign County. It crosses Ludlow Township and goes to Paxton and a different jurisdiction. And we've been talking some about regional planning and planning perhaps in 10 counties where you have to deal with natural areas on railroad beds that may be in Bloomington, but this is a Bloomington moraine. Can we look at this site and perhaps even augment it more? It is on a moraine, so you have to imagine a glacier sitting on top of this moraine, and temperature of the world was about constant for a time, and the gravel that was brought down from the Laurentian Shield in Canada had gotten smaller, and most of the big type house-sized pebbles have been dropped in Canada and Wisconsin, and by the time you get here, it's mostly gravel. And some of it has been in the ice and some of it on the ice. And it forms this moraine, and there we have this rather unique moraine at just north of Rantoul. There's the climate changes, and then the glacier retreats or advances. If it's colder, it'll advance to another place, or if it's warmer, it goes north. And eventually this glacier would probably only have about 4 feet of ice that was dribbling down the face of the moraine that had been formed by the accumulated gravel. And in front of that area was an outwash plain that was very swampy, as most of Champaign County was. Champaign County was settled late because of this swampiness, and it was laden with mosquitoes, and you could get malaria, and you could have fires on the prairie that you didn't know was going to happen and how it was going to happen and how you were going to survive them. So it was better to be in a forest, which still got fire, but it was more controllable, and the forest provided you with lumber and some protection from the wind and some animals that retreat from the prairie and come back to the forest. So we have that sort of situation, but we don't have a demonstration of it quite so clearly as you get with coming out of Rantoul across a very swampy piece of farmland that doesn't really get farmed because it's too swampy. Then there's a cemetery on sort of mesic ground, mesic meaning sort of middle moisture. And then you gradually go over a little prairie going up the hill toward Ludlow. And on top of the hill, it's kind of dry. And then it was covered with loess, which was, as the glacial meltways dried up, the very fine soil was blown across the country and deposited. So you can go to the top of that hill, and it's wet, it's slippery, it's not easy to be in, but the plants are used to it. And when it's in the middle of summer, the plants, it's drought and it's dry and it's as hard as the hobs of hell. And that plant still has survived. So here you have this range from wetland going up the face of the moraine, over the moraine, dry on the top, and then backside of the moraine down to Paxton. And we've said this many times, but I think it needs to be repeated because this is a wonderful site. And the extension of the Pope Prairie would be to go to Paxton, where there's another moraine that was carved into to allow railroads to go through without having to have a pusher to push the freight trains up and over the hill. So that gravel came to Champaign and raised the railroad so that you could have underpasses. This little bits of history make that site unique. If you walk through the cemetery, you have to know that these are the settlers that came here. But they're also part of the Chinook Air Force Base and the people who came and lived here and stayed here and died here. And so there's history right there in the cemetery. It's just on a little knoll, so it looks over some of this prairie stuff. And then there's a railroad line. That is abandoned. The term for it is consumed. It's an old interurban between the road and the railroad line proper, which is owned by Canadian National. So that gives you original remnant prairie from which we can take seed and augment what was a borrow pit, which is a gravel pit, where 8 feet of that glacial till has been removed for road development. And it's called the borrow pit, but you never bring the gravel back. So we're dealing with regrowth succession. This is like you came back after glaciation 10,000 years ago, and you're going to repopulate the original plants. In order to do that, we need sites that are original. And right next door is an interurban line, which is loaded with wonderful plants that tell you something about the era before settlement. And we like that. We don't disturb that. We don't plant into it. we harvest from it. It's been disturbed a little bit with the railroad bed and a Canadian National Railroad, but it's there, and we bring it across. We try not to do too much of one species. We try to figure out what the picture was. We'll never be accurate, but we do the best we can. And that is augmented by the fact that there was going to be a dual highway through, and it was replaced by 57. So it's vacant land, and it was planted to ash trees. So then the ash trees have a story to tell. They're taking the emerald ash borer and they're dying. And as the ash trees die, the prairie plants that were there originally when this land was bought are coming back without us doing anything like planting into them. It's just that they're getting more light and not shaded by the ash trees. But the ash trees were planted in a row, and when you do that, when you make a whole ecosystem one tree, then with one tree gets the ash borer, then the lot get it. If you are more biodiverse, you plant several trees in places like the quadrangle so that you don't lose all the elm trees in one fell swoop. So our 9 acres is augmented by the surrounding territories, which include the interurban line on the west and an unused second leg of a dual highway to the east. And then just south of that, there's about 8 acres of vacant farmland, which we would love to buy, borrow, beg, or steal, and plant to the same sort of remnant prairie. And remnant prairies are hard to reproduce, but if you have people like Doris Westfield in Vermilion County put together prairies that are really responsible, and so she, for the first time ever for the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, was awarded a recognition of her regrowth succession prairie because it was well known that Doris and her supporters collected seed from railroad beds, and that that prairie was the nearest we can possibly get to a remnant reconstruction. Most reconstruction prairies are limited to a number of plants that grow fairly well and succeed. First of all, the grasses will grow exceptionally easily, but then the broadleaves, you have to have a technique of getting the broadleaves in, so you have to make sure you don't put too many grasses in there to stifle the input of broadleaves. And gradually you can up the quality. And the borrow pit that we have is returning to native prairie, and it's wonderful to walk around in the spring and see the compass plants and the dock and the starry-eyed grass and the rosinweed and liatris, 2 types of liatris, and the purple coneflowers, and they're there, and it's getting to have its bacterial quality. It's gathering up little pieces of organic matter. So you have a little spot where there's a compass plant, and then there's some growth around it, then this litter falls down and it gives more organic matter, and gradually you're getting a 6 by 8 piece of return, and gradually it infills. So you're getting very near to having a native prairie. It will probably take another 40 years to really make it a genuine prairie, but it has to start somewhere. And that's sort of what we were at up there. The legal side of it has been important because it gives us the confidence to know that we have all our ducks in a row. We now have to join that to our tax exemption, and so we're in the process of doing that. So let me see what the time is. We've got to cut it now.
15 minutes.
Okay. Let me just look. Oh, I might mention that there is a possibility that the 8 acres is south of our 9 acres in Triangle. We'll put a map in here, and that we could have a kickstart program and see if we can cover the cost of buying that piece of land, which includes a nice little creek and wetland as well. And the cemetery next door has actually bought 6 acres of that farmland prior to what I'm talking about, and they've put in a rough, tough prairie in cooperation, and they for years have been also helpful in removing the litter. So our trip to the Pope Prairie on Saturday was rather successful. We didn't stay quite as long as usually because Ron has not so long ago had an operation on his hip, but we sort of came to the conclusion that the roadblocks were probably valuable. The littering problem is great, and the roadblocks are something you cannot get a tandem truck to, or a pickup truck, or anything else. So we were prepared with wheels, and in the future, if we have a busload of people like eye helpers come to that site, they can park just a little north of it and walk in, and that's okay. So we don't have to have traffic through. The advantage of having it litter-free is important. Let me see what else.
Quick question for you. You mentioned buying some of this land that's a little bit south of the current Pope Prairie. Yeah. Now, that used to be farmland, right?
Yes.
So how does that affect the prairie that you'd like to see established there, given that where you are now, you took away, 6-8 feet of farmland, and now if you go south of there, you've still got that topsoil. How does that factor in?
That topsoil has been herbicided and dealt with, fertilized, nitrogen and phosphate and what have you. So it is modified. So we would be gradually doing what Doris Westfield did in Vermilion County. We would go to railroad beds and adjacent areas and other sites that are in the community to reseed it and gradually get it back to normal. And it might take 10 or 15 years to look normal, but to get all the bacteria and the fungi and the wildlife back in there will take a lifetime and perhaps even several generations. The talent will be to keep that in action, but if key people pass on, it's very easy for that site to be forgotten about, and it will go back to farmland or seeds or weeds that we don't approve of. You have to think about that. And in order to do that, we probably will keep it in Heartland Pathways. We haven't found as yet someone to take over that in a serious manner, but that's why we have forest preserves and nature preserves commissions, and also Vermilion County is a conservation district, and so when you go to the forest preserve, you have to look to see that there's a real retinue of people who do these sorts of things. So could this particular site be a site which the forest preserve might take over? Since that hasn't happened yet, Heartland Pathways has had a penchant of getting ideas together and then finding a permanent place for that idea. And we haven't found that yet. But with a little bit of energy and supervision and people knowing the situation, then we can hope that site will remain as one of the very few sites locally that represent the prairie as it was many years ago. So we might have to inspire some sign making. We might have to have a little shed somewhere so you can have wheels to wheel into the corridor. We might have to remove some bumps on the road, some heat bumps that if you're walking down the area you don't recognize them, you can fall over. You just have to gradually work at it, and might take many years and some generations to do this. But if we see the opportunity to covet a little bit of agricultural land, then we may want to raise the money to buy that land and to put it into adjunct prairie space, where it might be where we do more teaching rather than walking through the genuine prairie to the north. We may be able to use the developed prairie as a more walk through with a trail and with signage. We don't want to have too many signs. We don't want to have a forest of signs. We are wanting you to know what your heritage prairie was. Okay, I think the next thing I want to say something about is the pocket prairie. It's still getting visitors. It's still getting people who say that this is an oasis. What's going to happen to it? And, well, we've had it for 30 years, and it was a place where there was two 30-foot signs, which were far too large for the regulations that go with federal highways, and University Avenue is a federal highway. So this was genuinely grandfathered in. That means it was, if the rules of the game change, you can exist in the existing rules for 10 years, and then you have to go to a smaller site. And then the site was vacant, so we figured that we could grow weeds there too, our own weeds, rather than community weeds that have to be mown or dealt with in various ways with herbicide. So the owner, Dr. Youngerman, and various people who have been managing it allowed us to put a prairie there, and it's been there for 30 years. So we're very thankful we had it that far. Just to straighten you out, we've had a lot of debate about where to put the plants, and it's likely that they may go to the Big Dig or the detention pond on 2nd Street, where there's already prairie plantings that are being maintained and that we like. But we would like to leave a little bit of a niche. It would seem that the pocket prairie is popular, it's well known, it has its moments where people might want to sleep there or do other things. It has conversation place, and but if there could be a walkout situation, not with tables, but with just a beer in hand and a seat somewhere, and music, then it would be nice to have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 prairie plants around that tell people what their heritage is. When you have 9-story buildings around the corner and thousands of people sitting in the roadside and in bars and whatnot, there is a certain number of those people who would love to have a niche, and we would like to suggest to the leasee that perhaps the pub could be a pocket prairie pub. and we could have some interior design that might have pictures of prairie, some good pictures of a pale purple coneflower or a liatris or a rosinweed or a clover and bumblebees and birds, and we would like to suggest that. So on Friday I had a landscape architect come that had many years ago brought us serviceberry trees to give us the forest part of the prairie forest ecosystem. So you had trees that were not so huge that they can lift up buildings, but they are large enough to provide a canopy. So we have a cardinal that comes has 2 families a year there, and we have finches and insects, including bumblebees and regular bees, and this has become a native site. So could that be an economically viable site? So yes, I think so. I think that for a new bar, this would give it some color and some definition. If it's near the prairie, you know where the bar is. Can we talk to the lessee, who's quite interested in what we do and very helpful, and the builders who are working with the building? Can we establish a little walkway, perhaps 4 feet rather than 8 feet, joining Chestnut Street with Market Street, so there's a flow through there? Would that be enough to get a wheelchair through? And they're thinking of putting up a wall that would allow the area to be filled in, and that would mean we lose prairie, but that's fair crack of the whip. We would agree to that, and it would need the appropriate railings to stop people from falling over the edge. And so people who are landscape architects get together with architects, and they find out what they can do, what variances they might be able to have, and how we might be able to have a few plants. Then there's the problem of having to supervise it. It's prairie, when it's in such a small amount, is not really going to look after itself. It's not something that you can plant and leave. It's perennial plants that are going to look after themselves. Doesn't always happen. So would this? So we were talking to Brown and Wood, who brought the trees in the first place and put in a bath for us so that we have wetland species in a block drainage situation. Would they be prepared to supervise this in perpetuity? It's too much to expect bartenders that are transient to look after something like this, especially if it's not their field of interest. But if you had a genuine landscaping company that was paid a nominal amount to come supervise and see that, so that plant's been rolled on, somebody stomped on it, or can it be maintained in an interesting fashion to give people in a gentrifying downtown an opportunity to have a contact with their heritage ecosystem. 94% of Champaign County was prairie. And we put in trees. You can hug a tree, but that was not our conservation district. In fact, to have a forest preserve is a misnomer in a way. It should be a prairie preserve. And that's not going to happen. But we live with that, and we think that if everyone is willing, we might retain a little prairie. Instead of carving it down so you get more privacy, we would keep it high so that you can look over the adjacent fence and see the university traffic or the railroad traffic, and perhaps broadcast a little music from there too. And that's sort of what the lessee is into. They have a pub in Heights of Peoria that has worked fairly well, and so they're trying this one. And we're talking. So, wow.
Yep, almost done.
Okay, so you know a little bit about what we're doing there, and it may happen. Just want to say something about garbage violations. This week I've pulled out an illegal computer that should not go to the landfill. I see this morning there's a yard umbrella in there with a bunch of steel that shouldn't necessarily go to the landfill without the steel being salvaged. I encounter people who throw cardboard in and tent it so that it takes up a lot of space. I have two large styrofoam boxes that have to go to the East Urbana. I would hope that someday we would have a styrofoam collection department in Champaign. It hasn't happened yet. But I also would say something about roofing. The roofing to the new building has involved taking off our old building, and there has been a lot of dust. And I would have preferred to have seen some sort of tunnel, which usually is put together by building people from a second, third floor, so that the material being thrown out does not create a bunch of dust. If you had a car parked there in recent time, it would be covered with dust, and that's not good for allergies, and it's not good for downtown. And I would hope something different would happen if the next building is going to be treated in that manner. So, this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. The views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and nobody else.